In the first episode of Culture Fit, I introduced myself as principal designer at All Turtles. I've been a member of the team since the early days, and I've been fortunate enough to work alongside a talented group of thoughtful people. But just like every organization, we know we're not perfect. All Turtles has plenty of room to grow, particularly when it comes to diversity and inclusion. This episode is about honesty. We're examining ourselves at All Turtles, and we're publishing our internal conversations in a public way so we can be transparent. We believe that if we ask ourselves the big questions, we'll ensure that we do better in the future. We'll hear directly from All Turtles CEO, Phil Libin. Phil's also the CEO of and he's the former CEO and co-founder of Evernote. He's led prominent tech companies for multiple decades. I'm also very excited to share interviews with the company's head of people, Colleen McGarry. We also spoke with the former chief of staff at All Turtles. Again, we're evaluating our company culture because we want to do better. We're not afraid to have honest but difficult conversations. I'm Darian Boyd. This is Culture Fit, Racial Bias in Tech. Okay, so this is a really good episode. Let's get straight into it. Here's Phil Libin. He's speaking openly about the diversity and inclusion at All Turtles. Part of the reason we decided to really focus on this topic, it emanates from the conversation we had earlier in June after George Floyd's murder. And we had a conversation internally within the team, and it spawned into all sorts of movements. And so one of the conversations that we talked about is that racism is intentional, right? It's baked in. It was designed to be that way. And so a metaphor you've brought up before is in Japan, there's a term kintsugi, which is to repair something that's broken, like a coffee cup that might have broken and you repair it and now it's better. But maybe we've talked about this metaphor not being the right lens to look at racism. It's about redesigning something, explicitly changing the way it works. What do you think about this framing and how do we move forward with this new perspective?
Yeah, I think I had always thought about most social problems in this framing of things being broken and needing to fix it, needing to kind of repair the damage. And it was really only recently, and really thanks to some of the things that you said and some other All Turtles employees said, that I started to kind of rethink that around, well, some problems aren't there because something's broken. Some problems are there because they're kind of designed that way. And redesigning something is a different motion than fixing it. And I think this has been something that's been at least somewhat eye-opening for me over the past few months.
There are no easy answers, but you made the decision to decline any board or panel opportunities that don't include women or people of color. And I believe similarly with your investments, you won't really invest in companies that don't employ women or people of color. So could you maybe talk about this prioritization and what that means for All Turtles and how we prioritize roles and how we've seen varying levels of success?
Yeah, I decided personally to basically resign from any board or group that I was on that didn't have women or people of color. But that's a personal decision. That's just a decision of saying, look, the whole point of saying something is systemic, right, is that systemic means it's not up to like individual small choices. It's kind of baked into the system. And so the way you have to work against it is to like do things that in the individual decisions may not actually seem, fair or necessary, because it's always easy to justify any particular case, right? Like every board that I'm in, it's easy to justify why for that particular case, well, it makes sense. But if you keep doing that, if you keep adding up all of the individual things that are justifiable, you end up with an overall society and structure that's not justifiable. So I kind of thought the only way forward is to say, I just have to kind of personally do things that don't feel comfortable to me. But I don't know if that's the right answer kind of in general. That's just something that I, decided to do. In terms of what we're trying to do at All Turtles and at our various companies, I think there's two parts, right? I think we try to work on things that, in our opinion, make the world better if those things succeed. So the first part is just what do we work on? And then the second part is how do we work on it? So like, what do we build and how do we build it? We try to make sure that the what we build is stuff that's good for the world, and the how we build it is, gets better and better and more fair and approaches the ideal of kind of where we want to be. And then, we're a company. We're a for-profit company. And so the tool set that for-profit companies have is money. a company is being genuine about something if it's spending money on that thing. And so we figure out ways to spend money to be able to have a more diverse and inclusive teams and have a plan to increase the amount of money we spend on that in specific ways. And I think that's the way to make progress.
And so to tie the conversation back, we know that there are brilliant people that have been hindered from reaching their potential because of societal pressures. We make a cognitive error. Maybe implicit bias is something that manifests commonly, where we're relying on these stereotypes. For instance, when we think of a certain profession, we also imagine physical attributes of the professional. So if I think of someone cleaning a public facility like a janitor, that might influence my brain to visualize a certain image. And so it's really important, I think, that we spot and address these biases. I'm curious, from your position, being a white male, your image represents what many think of as a CEO or a person of authority. And so these stereotypes can be dangerous. How do we navigate this? And what's your perspective on this issue?
I think often what gets in the way of perfectly reasonable observation is personalizing and kind of internalizing it. It's very easy for me to think, well, I'm not biased, right? Because it's easy for me to imagine that I know the insides of my own brain and I know the insides of my own heart. And I can say, well, I don't think I'm prejudiced. I don't think I'm racist. And I think for the vast majority of people, it's probably like that. And so anytime you have a conversation that gets immediately read as attacking someone's innermost kind of mind and morals and heart that runs contrary to how they see themselves, it's just like, it becomes very unproductive. It's kind of interesting how I think the word systemic racism, the term, I think is actually exactly right. Like systemic means that it isn't about like an individual preference. It means that this is the way the system is. It means that it's measurable. And the measurements are like very obviously like, sometimes I can't even believe, that we're having debates on TV and national politics about whether or not we have systemic racism, because I'm like, well, how is that even an opinion, whether or not we have it? You could just look at the results, right? You can just look at the numbers. You can just look at the differences in outcome by race, and like, they're obviously not equal. They're obviously not fair. And so, of course, it's systemic. The system is wired up in a way that Black people and other people with disadvantages just do have generally worse outcomes across a large number of attributes. And you can't really argue that. Obviously, the system is not fair. Obviously, the system is not balanced. We can all look at the same numbers, right, and just agree that it's not fair and not balanced. And somehow it got this way. And it wasn't magical, right? It's not like we inherited this system from like space aliens who handed it off to us and we don't understand it. Like, we built it, all of us. Like, we made it. And we can make a different system. And the biases that you're talking about, like, yeah, they exist in everyone or almost everyone. Some of them are benign, some of them are very malignant, but their results that you can measure are like unquestionable. So I think what I try to do for myself is to say, like, I just try to separate it from how I feel internally about like my own morality and what the actual effects are of the companies that I invest in or the companies that I run. Like, how are they doing? How's the world doing? And it's harder to lie to yourself if you're looking at numbers.
At All Turtles, we work hard to hire a diverse workforce. We see varying levels of success, but it's something that we've been committed to, including employing recruiters to find candidates from different backgrounds. And so, where do you think All Turtles has room to grow in this effort in terms of fostering a diverse and inclusive workplace?
Yeah, I think companies have a certain tool set, especially for-profit companies. That tool set is where we spend money. And yeah, we work hard to make an inclusive workforce, but maybe this sounds harsh. I don't mean it that way. But even more importantly than us working hard is we spend money to do it. That, I think, is for a company, how you know that it's serious is you look at the budgets. And so, yeah, as you said, like, we pay recruiters specifically to send us candidates that are outside of our network, right? We specifically pay recruiters to send us candidates that are women, that are people of color, so that we don't get, only white male applicants for most positions. And that costs money. We have to pay for this. And it costs time. We try to keep each job listing open for a few weeks, sometimes a month or two, rather than hiring the first person, just so that we can see and interview as many qualified people as possible, so that when we hire someone, we we want to know that that's actually the best person for the job. So like I feel like we're at least being authentic towards that. It's not a slogan. We're putting our very scarce resources towards this end. What we can do better is we could do more of it. As we start succeeding a little bit and we have a little bit more money, a little bit more resources, we could do this more. We could do this at a bigger scale. And we have to switch to paying more attention to kind of the second part of having a good team, which is, in the beginning, when you're a small startup, building a team is all about recruiting, right? It's all about who you hire. Once you get to be kind of a medium-sized company and you're a few years old, and we're just starting to get to that point, who you retain is actually more important than who you hire, or at least as important. For most startups, you don't really pay attention to the retention and career development because it's just not very many people that are already on the team. So bringing new people on is important. But we're just getting to the phase now where the retention and career development is getting to be really important. And we need to start spending money and resources on that. So we're figuring out how do we make sure that we keep the best people, and how do we make sure that they can advance in their careers, and how do we have the right coaching and mentoring and career development. And again, it's going to come down to spending money on it. It's not just talking. It's going to be having to hire coaches and trainers and mentors and have stats and see what's working and what's not. And I think those are the areas of our future improvement, is just spending more time and money on all of this, and also starting to focus on retention and career development, not just hiring.
So the results are there in terms of ROI. When we talk to people that are on the front lines of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they talk about, like you said, retention, or even the quality of what's being produced, being elevated, benefiting from a diverse workforce within an organization. And so it seems like the obvious path as a company is to invest in this, yet companies at the same time, at least in Silicon Valley, they seem unwilling to prioritize this unless they're constantly having their feet held to the fire. Is it a short-sightedness, or are the gains too far downstream for companies to see the long-term value? Why is there this disconnect?
I think you get the ROI pretty quickly. I'm thrilled by the quality of work that we produce and by the team that we have, and there's no way we could be producing, I think, similar quality work as quickly with a different team. Like All Turtles is my fourth company, is my fifth company. I've never seen better teams. I don't mean better as in more diverse. They're also more diverse, but I mean better in terms of like producing amazingly high quality work on time and on budget. And that's never been better. So the ROIs come fast. But maybe what's happening is for companies, especially tech companies, especially around here, that pride themselves on moving really, really quickly and producing high quality stuff fast and repeatedly, I think the ROI comes super fast. So if there's resistance and hesitancy, I mean, maybe it's a combination of people haven't thought it through correctly. It is difficult, right? You do often feel like you're under attack. As a white guy, like I often feel uncomfortable in these conversations because there's a not very subtle subtext that's just beneath the surface of me feeling like I am personally being blamed for stuff, even if that's not the intent of the person I'm talking to. Sometimes it might be, sometimes it isn't. But, it's easy to feel bad about this. And it's really hard to work on something that makes you feel bad. So you just have to kind of depersonalize it. You have to say it's systemic. You look at the system, you figure out metrics, you figure out goals. I try to look at it as scientifically as possible and try to not feel like I'm being attacked. But it's tough. Like it's tough for me, and I try to be mindful about these things. I'm sure it's tough for others as well.
I want to touch on your experience leaving the Soviet Union. You moved to the Bronx in New York at 8 years old. I think you've mentioned that your family was really lucky to get out of that situation. Can you talk about what it was like coming into a new culture, new surroundings, new everything essentially, and what that was like? How did that shape you moving forward?
So my family and I were refugees from the Soviet Union in 1979. There was a bunch of refugees that got out around that time period. We were Jewish. We were stateless. And so, we lived in the Bronx. We were poor. I mean, we didn't, my parents came over without anything. They were both classical musicians in the Soviet Union, which was hard to get a job as a musician without speaking any language in your, mid to late 30s in the US. So it's kind of interesting. Like I never really, like my whole identity and how I think of myself is different. Like I'm obviously white, but I didn't think of myself as that for a very long time because originally what I was Jewish. And that was, at least in the Soviet Union, subject to a lot of discrimination and kind of outright violence. When I came to the US, I was living mostly in a neighborhood with Black and, there was a lot of Black people, there's a lot of Puerto Rican people, there's a lot of immigrants. There was relatively few white people. So most of my friends were people of color. all of us were programmer nerds, and a bunch of my friends were, I always considered to be very similar to me. We liked Star Trek, we pirated computer games. Several of them, at least, were really brilliant. And it wasn't until much later when I left this, I went to college, that I kind of started to realize that, like, yeah, outcomes are different from us, because like I grew up kind of poorer than them. We were on food stamps, we got government cheese, all that stuff. I didn't think about race. I didn't see myself as particularly white. I didn't realize that my Puerto Rican or Black friends were that different. But yeah, by the time, kind of got out of that neighborhood and got to college and kind of started seeing that I was getting all these opportunities, and they kind of weren't. I'm still the only person of that friend group that wound up leaving. So it was a realization that it doesn't really matter how I see myself. What matters is how the world sees me. And the world definitely sees me as a white man that can be a CEO and is relatively trustworthy and dependable, and things are a lot easier for me than for a lot of the people I grew up with.
Thank you for sharing that story, Phil. It resonates with me a lot. And I wonder, one of the episodes in the series is the pipeline fallacy. I don't love this term because I think, again, it dehumanizes people, right? It reduces them to a commodity it's like someone's responsibility to feed humans to a corporation. What's your perspective on that? I'm sure you've heard the term as a VC and even today at All Turtles. What is the reality around the pipeline?
Yeah, I've used that term myself. I have, when I was CEO at Evernote, somebody asked me about, in this case, it was the case of women, about how many women were we hiring around the team. And at Evernote, we did a pretty good job with women at the kind of higher executive levels. I think more than half of my direct reports were women. Basically, every department was okay. It felt a lot better than Silicon Valley average. But except for one department, which is engineering. And in engineering, it was like 3% women or something back when I was there. Hopefully, it's much better now. And I was asked about this, and I said that I looked at it, and it's a pipeline thing. That was my answer. Because when I look at how many candidates are we interviewing, we're only getting about 2 or 3% of our candidates for engineering positions are women, and we're hiring them at the same rate as we're hiring men. So I was like, well, it's the pipeline. We're not getting enough candidates. So I've used that answer myself. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I realized that that's just wrong. And I had to kind of realize this for myself. I kind of said, well, okay, look, this math just doesn't make sense. Because I said, fine, let's just assume that we're only going to hire Stanford grads, computer science Stanford graduates. Obviously, that's not true. We hire all sorts of people, but let's just say we're only going to hire, the equivalent of entry-level computer science positions that are, Stanford graduates. I said, okay, well, what percentage of the Stanford graduating class for computer science are women? And I think that year it was something like 18%, which is like super low, right? Obviously, it would be 50%, but it was only 18%. Okay. But of the people we were seeing, we were only seeing 3% women. So like, what happened to the other 15%, right? Like, yeah, it's a pipeline problem, but unless we were getting at least 18% of our inbound candidates being women, then like we were doing worse than the previous step in the pipeline. So whose fault is that? And I realized, well, it's my fault. Well, at least it's my responsibility. We need to spend more money, more time. We need to figure out a way to at least not be like the kink in the pipeline. So if it really was just pipeline math, then we would have had 18% women, not 3, which is still too low. But 18 that's 6x better than where we actually were. So I think like for people who say it's a pipeline problem, well, the first step is, okay, fine, pipeline problem. Let's look at the pipeline. Let's look at the funnel. We know how to do funnel analysis. Let's look at it. Let's be honest about it. Are we the pinch point in the funnel? Until every CEO can say, I am not the pinch point, or at least like the people who are under my employ are not the pinch points of the pipeline, then we are, and then we have to fix it. And if everyone did that, then of course there'd be no pipeline problem. But at the very least, like until we got to 18%, I shouldn't have been blaming Stanford. I agree with you. It's distasteful to talk about it as a pipeline, but the whole phrase human resources is distasteful to some extent. But it's also good to be able to actually measure things and to be honest with the numbers. And if you want to think about it as a pipeline, okay, just be honest about it and make sure that you're not the pinch point in the funnel. And I think pretty much every CEO in Silicon Valley, if they look at it that way, they're going to realize they are the pinch point.
Phil, thank you again for joining us. I learned so much from you, and I continue to learn a lot from you. So I really appreciate your time.
Well, likewise for me, Darian, thank you for doing this. I've learned a bunch from you that that I feel like this is the best kind of learning, because like it's the sort of thing that I feel afterwards, like I'm kind of embarrassed that I learned this just now. Like, this feels like the sort of thing that I should have known for a long time, but it's better than still being ignorant of it. So thank you for all the work and just for the amazing work on other projects at All Turtles.
Phil's a thoughtful person. It really shines in how he leads All Turtles. I'm fortunate enough to work alongside a CEO that can speak honestly about diversity and inclusion. As a company, All Turtles invests in building a diverse team. As individuals, we echo a desire for hiring more diverse talent. And so as we continue to grow, we hope to expand who we can include in the studio, not just within the team, but also the products that we build. We definitely won't get there, and we certainly wouldn't be where we are today without the head of people at All Turtles. Here's Colleen McGarry. You've managed anything and everything related to people operations. You're essentially a one-person team for a lot of All Turtles operations. So there's a lot of pressure and accountability in that role. I think other people in startups might relate to wearing many hats. How do you balance these responsibilities, and how do you navigate this?
I think a common theme throughout the organization, not just with my role, but with many other colleagues, both managers and individual contributors, is I think what we would call ruthless prioritization. One of the things I've always appreciated actually about working at All Turtles is that everybody's realistic about that.
I think there's probably a collective responsibility of all employees at All Turtles to try to keep each other safe. What's your perspective on this, and how do we do a better job of sharing this responsibility and fostering an inclusive environment?
And that's a really hard question to answer. I think that at the end of the day, it does help to have someone be responsible for it, because if someone isn't, then no one is. It is, I think, a thing that people can share in, but having someone be the end of the line in terms of accountability is how you ensure something like safety, whether it is physical safety or psychological safety, or economic safety.
What's your general philosophy on building a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture at All Turtles?
I believe in building a diverse and equitable culture in the world. Everybody deserves to be treated fairly and equally and with justice. And we have a long way to go, but it's, small, bite sized steps and pieces as we go along.
What are the things All Turtles is doing to make this happen? And how can the rest of the All Turtles staff expand our ties to continue this effort?
So I think that tangible things that we do are, and we're not, I also want to say up top that we're not perfect. It's not flawless. There's always room for improvement. And we get kind of stuck between time and urgency and bandwidth. As you said earlier, I am right now a hiring team of one. But that said, some of the things that we do include writing a job description for every single job. So being clear from the get-go about what the expectations of the role are and writing it down so that there's accountability about that is one thing that we do. We try to post our job descriptions as early as possible. We've had some that have been posted for several months, just to give ourselves some time to get a bunch of candidates into the pool. And also, the more opportunity you have to put them on more niche job boards or network with your colleagues. The other thing, too, I think, is being very cognizant about the networks that your colleagues bring in. The people that are more likely to be more like you, and that can be great. And that can also lead to homogeneity. We have a bunch of folks on our staff right now who worked at one particular company together and at various different times. And I'm very sensitive as a person who didn't work there about what it might feel like to be a person who's not in that club, and wanting to make sure that we're reaching out to people who worked at different places and aren't in the networks of those people.
Thank you for the insight, Colleen. With the last few minutes, I would love to touch on retention as a general topic.
Sure. I feel so grateful that we have the retention that we do. So I'm going to be completely honest. We have somehow done a really terrible job retaining Black women, and it's embarrassing. And it's also really hard to talk about because it's never going to be any one issue. And so I just know that I feel badly about it and that we have done poorly and I want to fix it. That said, I feel grateful that on the whole, All Turtles retention has been extremely high. By and large, people have stayed and we haven't put a ton of intentionality around that. So I think if we do, even more people will stay even longer. As we grow, we'll have just a little bit more space and bandwidth for people to grow. And that's another reason that people can or will or do stay at companies is because they're growing in their skills. And so that's something that I think we're looking forward to in the next kind of couple of years as things look much rosier and optimistic for AT.
I'm so grateful for Colleen. She spoke candidly. It's hard to imagine all of the challenges that Colleen has to balance, and what she said is true. Our company has failed to retain Black women on the staff. Black women aren't protected in Silicon Valley either. To the contrary, we learned in the previous episode of Culture Fit that tech enables harm to Black women. If you followed along with the series, you heard from dozens of accomplished professionals that happen to be Black, many of them women. And an easy way to prioritize Black women is to simply listen. I'm very excited to introduce Kathy Dinas. She was previously Chief of Staff at All Turtles, and she's currently an amazing friend and amazing person.
Hi, I'm Kathy Dinas. I consider myself the Beyonce of operations because why not? She's amazing. I'm amazing sometimes. I was previously at All Turtles, which is why I think you guys invited me to this podcast.
Well, you mentioned that you are great sometimes, and I can validate that you are absolutely great to me at during your time at All Turtles.
Thank
I want to
you.
thank you for the amount of love and compassion you shared with me as well as others. You took time to check in with me often. We had so many difficult conversations together. I think it helped strengthen our relationship to this day. So I really appreciate what you've done for me. How do you go about building meaningful relationships in the workplace?
I think I always looked at being at work and the work relationships that I have as family. And so it's always important that I know who I work with, what their values are, how they're really feeling, and make them feel important from the CEO to the maintenance person. All those roles matter.
I feel that a common way people experience harm in the workplace is simply feeling alone or even alienated. I don't think this is an uncommon feeling. I imagine many people go through it at some point in their career. And I think my experiences are no different. Even at All Turtles, I can say that there have been moments where I've felt alone or alienated, and not being heard or being ignored is demoralizing, humiliating even. Can you talk about feeling this sort of experience and how do you navigate feeling alienated? What can someone do that's in that position to rise above that isolation?
Yeah. One thing I really liked that Phil did when I was in meetings with him is he'd always turn and ask me, like, what I thought. And I don't think I appreciated that until, now that I'm looking back, and whether he was genuinely curious about what my idea was or just being intentionally practicing making sure someone else's voice was heard in the room. It's important because it's so easy to kind of, also make yourself shrink to not engage. Even if you have ideas, you might be scared to speak out on them.
Colleen comes to mind at All Turtles, being the head of people operations, to try to oversee everyone within the population and make sure that everyone is taken care of somewhat equally, right? And I think your position of chief of staff, there's definitely overlap there. You're responsible for people essentially. And that's difficult. Can you talk about that? What is it like trying to help a population of people sort of in a silo?
I think I think it's very intentional, right? It's so easy as the head of people or chief of staff to ignore things that are going on around you. You see someone with their head down at their desk, you can walk by and not say anything, or you could walk over and ask the individual if they're okay, or you can send them a note later and say, "Hey, I saw you seemed a little upset. Is everything okay?" But it has to be intentional in how you support your team because everybody's coming to work with a different lens, a different experience, a different why and purpose.
An individual that identifies as a Black woman, such as yourself, I feel is probably the least protected in a tech monoculture. That's reflected in data. The data shows that that's the case. Colleen even mentioned candidly that All Turtles has a problem with retaining Black women. I don't think that's unique to All Turtles. I'm curious, what's your perspective on that? Where are the times where you felt protected, and what can entities, organizations, companies do to show that they believe in the advancement of Black women and that they're there to protect Black women?
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think back to a couple years ago when I first interviewed with Phil, and I could tell like we would get along. But one of the things that I was actually kind of dwelling on and noodling on was this is someone that is extremely well known in both Silicon Valley and worldwide because of the products that he's built, successful companies that he's led. But I was also a little nervous like, okay, if I walk into a meeting with someone, are they going to close the door right before I get in or assume I'm his assistant or assume that I'm, his I don't know what they would have assumed. And I asked him the condition that I would take this role is that he has to have my back. And I made it very clear. I was like, folks are going to look at me. I'm going to look this young for like another 30 years. Like, you need to also help me by standing up for me, having my back. And it was very intentional on my part. It was important to me when I started All Turtles. It was pretty diverse. I walked in, I was like, oh, there's some Black people here. Awesome. Women in leadership. Like, there was a woman co founder. I was already seeing some diversity. So I'm like, okay, we're like, he gets it and he's trying to build a space that is inclusive with the type of technology that's going to be created. The other thing I realized was like, I do not want to be the only one. And as I was walking in and knowing that I was the only Black woman on staff, I said, the next people that we're looking for or hiring, we have to be intentional about casting a wider net. And so to what Colleen says in terms of retention, I think, I don't know if I've fully processed that experience. There's so many things that I love and enjoy about my time at All Turtles, and I just sometimes it's hard to even process. But I was fortunate to be able to lean on the other Black women there and to lean on you and feel kind of seen, even in times where I felt like I wasn't even being seen or heard. Now I feel like I'm processing over the phone and that's kind of weird. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to put into words succinctly. I will say one thing. We learn in kindergarten to treat others the way you'd want to be treated. And that is just, I guess that's one of the golden rules. I'm going to make it a golden rule. If you don't like to be interrupted in meetings, don't interrupt people in meetings. If you want to be celebrated and you want promotions, you want to be acknowledged for your work, then offer that to others as well. It is something that everyone can do and benefit from. And that's one way I think we could start protecting Black women in the workplace and all folks really, like folks who are the most silent, folks who aren't really speaking out because they're scared, and just treat folks how you want to be treated. And I like, I'm super proud. I'm so like proud of the work that folks at All Turtles are doing now. Like, I'm watching and I'm cheering because I think my leaving in a way kind of sparked like a desire for more authenticity and transparency. And I think that All Turtles is asking the right questions right now and coming to the right realization. I'm thankful for like the relationships I've made there. I still see Phil as a mentor. I text him all the time. And, everybody's learning. So I love to see it.
I also see Phil as a mentor. Many people do. But I can't thank Kathy enough for sharing her voice. A lot of the conversations in this episode, really throughout the series, they hit home for me. It's ridiculously lonely to be the only at a company, or even the only on a team. Even worse if you're undervalued because the culture around you just doesn't get what you have to offer. It's miserable. I've felt that way. I've wondered if leadership sees me as a leader sometimes, or as someone that's less than. We talked to over 30 people for Culture Fit. We spent hundreds of hours to make sure that this message was heard. The people that are often undervalued or even unwelcomed need to be heard. Intimate conversations with each guest, they were personal and often emotional. Intimate in a way that brought up my own racial trauma I experienced during childhood and adulthood. I carry these experiences with me to work every day, and I wake up in the morning sometimes with my jaw clenched. People that carry the burden of talking about race, they do so in hope that the future won't have to deal with the same mess. What you're listening to is All Turtles Growing Through Introspection. All Turtles has a commitment to do better. Phil, Colleen, and Kathy, they're all experts. They're experts of their craft, and they're also experts of their own experiences. For the final interview of this episode, we're going outside of All Turtles and hear from someone with a ton of things that we can all learn from. Mariah Driver. Mariah's experience as the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Webflow, something you don't want to miss. Open a notepad because she's got a wealth of insights on how to shape an equitable company through diversity. Here's the interview. Thank you for joining us, Mariah. As the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Webflow, what does your role entail?
My role essentially comes down to three things. Number one is that I partner with our people team to audit our existing processes. So we have a hiring process, we have a promotion process, we have a advancement process. Those are just a few of the processes that we have. So looking for differences in experience or differences in outcomes between demographic groups. And hiring, for instance, will look at different pass-through rates for different demographic groups in our hiring process to see if we're noticing a significant drop-off for one group after a certain stage than another. At that point, we can kind of evaluate what are we really looking for at that stage, and are we potentially creating barriers to entry for specific groups. The second thing I do is I partner with our leaders to help them work through what it takes to essentially be an inclusive leader. So how they can lead a diverse team. And the last thing I do is driving accountability. So working with everyone across our company to see kind of how can we all make diversity, equity, and inclusion a part of our daily jobs.
What are some of the DEI projects you've led at Webflow since stepping into this role?
I'll start with kind of a definition of how we actually define diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is relative. And one of the things that I will kind of challenge is that a candidate can't be inherently diverse, because what makes a candidate diverse is relative to what the team makeup is. So we really try to strive for diversity in the sense of, are we balanced? And then equity is outcome. So we look at equity as, if you look at the 15 people that we hired in 2019, are we seeing an equitable outcome for every single group? If all of those people are white, or all those people are male, or maybe all those people are able-bodied, that's not representative of the population we're actually interviewing and hiring from. And inclusion is really, it's a feeling. Do our team members feel like they can bring their full self to work? That not only won't be held against them, but it will actually be embraced and valued. We don't want to build a company where people feel like they can be here as a Black person, but only because other people claim they don't see color. That's not what we want to do. That's not bringing your full self to work. That's actually bringing a part of yourself to work, and luckily having people around you say that they don't acknowledge that other part. So that's how we define the terms and kind of what we're really working towards. And to name three initiatives, one, we've launched our affinity groups. So if they have professional development needs, essentially they can meet any kind of need that that group feels would be helpful for their success at the organization. Another thing has been, we've launched a series of anti-racism workshops. And then lastly, we've recently implemented what we call the Rooney Rule Plus. So it's an adaptation of a Rooney Rule that's already been launched, started in the NFL, which essentially Webflow mandates that every hiring team and hiring manager interviews at least 2 candidates from an underrepresented group in the final stages of their interview process. So we're not setting a quota for who we hire, but we're holding ourselves accountable to make sure that we set ourselves up for success in hiring folks from underrepresented groups. And the only way you can hire someone from an underrepresented group is if you interview that person in the final stages. We are eradicating barriers to entry throughout the process and that we're proactively identifying them before we make an offer. So we make sure that we're not allowing bias to influence who we hire, because we're not necessarily preventing or eradicating bias completely, but we're checking ourselves at each stage of the process to make sure that we do have candidates represented from different backgrounds and identity groups who have a chance to be hired for the role.
You recently wrote on Twitter that leading diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts takes time and that it's important to not rush to hasty solutions. Can you speak on this philosophy and your approach to DEI implementation? Where should companies, founders, listeners start?
It's a really good question. So I think that the first step to take is to really get clear about what you're trying to do and what you're talking about. So I get a lot of emails from folks saying, I really want to, focus on D&I in my organization. What are some things I can do to do that? I often turn back to them and I say, before I answer that, I would like to understand can you define what diversity means to you? When you're talking about diversity, what kind of diversity are you talking about? And once you get to that point, then the next step is naming the right problems. So if you define diversity as kind of racial and ethnic diversity at your company, and that's something you want to work towards building more of, it's to say, okay, what is preventing us from getting there? And in order to effectively have that conversation, you can't shy away from naming things like racism and white supremacy. So how do you take responsibility for the fact that if your company lacks racial diversity, that's by design. That's not a coincidence. That's not because there aren't enough qualified candidates from those groups. That's actually because the hiring process, the way that you talk about your company, are designed to appeal to a certain group and to essentially perpetuate systems that disadvantage other groups. And then I think lastly, the next step to take is to say, okay, what are we committed to and what trade-offs are we willing to make? And I think this is where a lot of D&I efforts fail. And what you see with a lot of companies who came out with anti-racism statements and saying we're going to do better is a lot of people are now wondering, okay, what, month or 2 months later is saying, what have you done? What have you done that's better? What outcomes have changed? What are you working on? What are you working towards? And the key that was missing there for that actually to happen, for their statements and intentions to align with their impact, is that there wasn't accountability. They weren't being held accountable. So that's the third piece, is saying, if you are a leader and you are saying this is important to you, you have to acknowledge that doing the same thing the way that it's worked for you in the past is no longer going to work for you in the future. And how are you going to navigate that? And what trade-offs are you going to be willing to make to get there?
What kind of questions do you think tech leaders everywhere need to be asking themselves about DEI? What questions led to an honest and productive assessment of where a company's at in your experience?
I know there are a lot of people who are just starting their DEI journeys now. The first question to ask is why now? So why is it important now? And why hasn't it been important before? And that doesn't mean that it hasn't been prevalent for African American people, for people who suffer from a disability, from people who, haven't had the privilege of going to an accredited university. It's been in their face the whole time. It's unignorable. But as a leader, and oftentimes, especially leaders who belong to privileged groups, it hasn't been important to them in the past because it hasn't affected them. It's benefited them. It's systems that's benefited them. The reality is, if you are someone who comes to me and says, I want to prioritize diversity and inclusion, where do I start? I automatically believe that your intentions are in the right place, and you're probably a good person if you're willing to have that conversation in the first place. What prevents that conversation from advancing into a productive place is that oftentimes the next question is, okay, what has prevented you from doing this work up until now? And that takes a level of humility that someone would have to shed the need to be right and to be able to say, because it wasn't something that affected me personally. That's why it hasn't been important to me before. And now I am more aware of how this is affecting me and benefiting me. These systems are benefiting me and really disadvantaging other people that I care about. And so now I care about this and now I'm prioritizing it. And that doesn't make you a bad person. That just makes you human, is that, again, you have these biases, you have your own blind spots to really what's going on. So I think that is the first really important question, is why now? And I think that actually will ground the work too, because if your answer to why now is because it's a hot topic, other companies are doing it, you can pretty much quit there, because that means that the only thing that's keeping you going in this work, and again, it's a long game, it's not a short game. If the only thing keeping you going is that there's external pressures, eventually when that fades out, your work fades out. And I think that's something that, again, you don't want to get to the point of having happen. So within that question is kind of like, how am I going to continue to hold myself accountable to do this difficult work?
We'll leave Mariah's questions for you to reflect. And internally at All Turtles, we're going to have more conversations to examine how we can grow. One thing's for sure, it's a never-ending journey to build and maintain environments that are diverse, inclusive, and equitable. There's no checklist. It's much more than that. In the next and final episode of Culture Fit, we'll feature experts who make the tech industry more inclusive. We'll talk about what the tech industry could look like in the future and how we'll all work together to make it truly equitable. Thank you so much for listening, and really a big thank you to Mariah Driver, Kathy Dinas, Colleen McGarry, and Phil Libin. They took the time to interview with us. For more information about the guests that were featured throughout the series, you can check out our website. It's all-turtles.com/podcast. If you've enjoyed the series, help us out by sharing with your colleagues and friends. Also, leave us a review. It helps the word get out. Thanks to the behind-the-scenes team, including Marie McCoy-Thompson, for editing, producing, and co-writing the show. And thanks to Jim Metzendorf, he mixed the show, as well as a big thank you to Dorian Love for the great music he composed. I'm Darian Boyd, and I'll see you in episode 6 of Culture Fit. It's our grand finale. We're going to take a look at everything we've discussed so far and learn how to apply these lessons in actionable ways to build a more inclusive future.